Wonderful, wonderful. Bienvenidos and welcome to our conversation on restoring balance in the climate, racial justice, and health equity storyline. We're excited to have you all join us today for an expert panel and conversation on shifting the narrative on issues related to climate, racial justice, and health equity. My name is Chantel Stewart. I'm a member of Metropolitan Group, and I'll be your MC for today's conversation, as well as your in-house tech support. So if during this webinar you have any technical difficulties, please send a chat to panelists, and I'll jump right in to assist you. We'd like for this to be more of a discussion. So as you have questions or comments, please type them into the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can through the course of the conversation. Also, if you have questions for a specific panelist, please be sure to include their name in the chat. Zoom has also recently added accessibility features. You should see an icon for a live transcript at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click into that and choose the bottom link to enable auto transcriptions, you should begin to see Zoom transcribe audio from this session in real time. We'd also like for you to know that this webinar is being simultaneously interpreted into Spanish by our interpreter, Carlos Calderon. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a globe icon. Simply click on this icon and click the language that you'd like to hear spoken. So, for example, if you'd like to hear this conversation in Spanish, please click the globe and select Spanish. We encourage you to live tweet if you'd like, using the hashtags Power of Voice or Migration Narratives. And please be sure to tag and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @MetGroup. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're excited to get this conversation started. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today's event, Surili Sutaria Patel, Vice President at Metropolitan Group. Surili.
Thank you so much, Chantel, for being our fearless MC today, and to Carlos for doing the important work of translating our conversation to our Spanish-speaking audience. Before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. While we're gathered on virtually, I'm sitting on Piscataway land, and I feel it's important to have that grounding because we're talking about the ways in which our history is shaping our today and in our future. So let's dive right in. Climate change has profound impacts on our health. We often call it a threat multiplier. It certainly is going to be one of those phenomena that we all experience in our lifetime, and many of us will feel the health ramifications of climate change, but we won't feel them the same. And that's where the equity challenge comes in. Some of us, and I like to call this short group, the young, the old, the different, and the poor, will experience them way differently than others and may not even have a chance to recover. When we're talking about young, I'm talking about children who aren't just little people, but they're really have different systems, internal systems, where they breathe more air and drink more water per body unit. And that makes them more susceptible to things like wildfire smoke. On the other end of the age spectrum are older adults who may have mobility limitations, which make it more challenging to evacuate after a storm or a hurricane. And then there's people that are living in low wealth communities where the infrastructure may not be there to protect them after some flooding. So they have standing water that could lead to injuries or access to transportation, or that standing water could lead to be a perfect breeding ground for vector-borne diseases. And there's communities of color. And one example of a barrier could be access to information because of the language barrier. So there's many ways that different populations could be impacted by climate change. And I only named a few. There's so many more: those experiencing homelessness, pregnant people, student athletes, migrant workers, outdoor workers, and so many more. But I don't want to stop the conversation there. What I think is tremendously, tremendously important is to talk about the determinants of our health. It's so easy to say, oh, let's just go to the doctor's office to get a prescription to heal those climate impacts on our health, but it's not the case. 20% of what it takes to achieve good health happens in healthcare. The other 80 typically take place in the structural and societal determinants of health. So what's around us, including racism? I'm not going to go into defining racism and structural racism, but what I will say is we have a challenge where racist policies and practices have had and continue to have profound impacts on our health. Layered on with climate change, because we don't live in the singular, we are experiencing even graver impacts. So for example, health impacts of COVID-19 and climate change are two phenomena that are happening at the same time. And I'll just say that the phenomenon, the coincidence isn't that they're happening at the same time. The coincidence is that they're happening to the same people in same communities, and they're further devastating them, whether it's infrastructure or health, even further than the general population. So today we're going to talk about narrative. Now, narrative talks to us, it speaks to us in ways in which are so ubiquitous to our society, to our culture. Narrative shows up in so many different places, and it shapes the way we think of the situation around us. It shows up in the clothes we wear, the logos on our clothes. It shows up in our art. It shows up in even as big as our city plans. The dominant narrative around climate, racial justice, and health equity is now at a pivot point to shift. And today's key question is, why now? What are we going to do to shift it, and why are we going to do it now? As the late John Lewis used to say, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? It's the time. So I am deeply honored to introduce you to this wonderful panel who will help us kind of dive in and dig into the amazing challenge of what it means to say we're restoring balance in the storyline of climate change, racial justice, and health equity. First, we have Vernice Miller-Travis, Executive Vice President at Metropolitan Group. Vernice is one of the nation's most innovative and respected thought leaders on environmental justice and the interplay of civil rights and environmental policy. Dr. Adrienne Hollis is another panelist and is the founder of Hollis Environmental Consulting Services and of counsel at Metropolitan Group. Adrienne is an advocate for disenfranchised and environmental justice. And there's Jacqui Patterson, who's the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project and of counsel at Metropolitan Group. Jacqui centers her work around facilitating self-determination and power building with frontline communities. Last but not least is Dr. Shadiin Garcia, Executive Vice President at Metropolitan Group and Organizational Strategy Innovation Lead across education, philanthropy, advocacy, policy, strategy, and leadership. Shadiin works to counteract the systemic inequity created by colonization. So let's dive right in. Vernice, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Many environmental justice advocates and scholars have suggested that we need to fully understand how racism and racial bias have influenced our understanding of climate change and our response to it. Can you describe how acknowledging the ways that racial bias has influenced the dominant narrative around climate change and how we should change it to more fully account for the ways that BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are bearing the brunt of climate change impacts?
Thank you, Surili. So I guess you just want to dive right into the heart of the conversation and not just, skittle up at the edge and eventually wade our way in. You want to go right to it. So let's do that. I think, as often happens in so many conversations about environment, people tend to think about the impacts on our coasts, the impacts on our oceans, if they think about it at all. So let's sort of reset the moment to that. If they think about impacts at all, and if they are cognizant that climate change is all around us, it's intensifying, it's shaping our lives and transforming our lives in every way imaginable, what they think about are impacts on our coast, impacts on our oceans, fires intensifying in the Pacific Northwest and the West and the Southwest. They think about species being impacted. They think about the things that for so long have dominated our understanding in North America of what environment is. But they don't think about people, and they don't think about the people who have borne the brunt of every adverse issue that you can imagine. The people who are poor don't have the ability to respond to these climate challenges in the same fashion. People who are unhoused, people who are immunocompromised, people who are facing a variety of health challenges in this moment of the COVID pandemic. We are talking about people need to be prepared for storms, but they can't go into shelters. The people who are most impacted by all of that and so many more issues that I haven't even mentioned are, for the most part, indigenous and people of color in these United States, as well as poor and working class white folks, but intensely BIPOC communities, Black, indigenous, and people of color communities are at the front lines of all of those impacts, and they feel those impacts in a more intense way. I'll give one example. And how we don't seem to be able to learn from our previous experiences. So if we look back at Hurricane Katrina in 2005, people say that no one was prepared for that. Well, no one was prepared for that because no one thought about the vulnerable populations that were all along the glide path of that storm. No one thought about those folks. But one thing that came to mind that happened again in our most recent experience in the hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast were it came in between pay periods. Why is that important? Because poor people are living paycheck to paycheck. Many communities of color are low income and are living paycheck to paycheck. But again, from 2005 to 2021, what is that, 16 years? We did not learn that as the intensity of the storms are coming, and the intensity of the impacts are rolling forward, the same people are going to be impacted again and again and again in the same ways. And those same people are people of color. Those same people are indigenous people. Those same people are poor people who don't have the ability to be able to respond. It's nice to say people should get out of the way of the storms. People should leave the fires. But what if you can't leave? What if you have nowhere to go? And for so many people of color who are mired in our history of residential segregation, our history of living in ecologically vulnerable places, are they living there because they can't think of any place else to live? They're living there because they were forced to live there. So if we go back to our thinking about the Trail of Tears, right? And we think about where indigenous people were moved from the East Coast into places in the West, places that were ecologically unsustainable, where they couldn't grow food, where they didn't have access to other resources, where they were put in places that were not meant to be thriving, or where they were forced to live in places that were ecologically vulnerable. And what do I mean by that? Many people of color live in ecologically vulnerable places, flood zones. And people keep asking year in and year out, why don't they just move, right? Well, they're living in places that they were forced to live in because of the rigidity of residential segregation based on race, based on skin color, based on ethnicity. And they were living from day one in floodplains and flood zones. So is it surprising that those same people are going to be impacted again and again and again? Every hurricane season, we say, wow, it's really horrible what's happening to those people, as opposed to putting in place systems and structures to move people out of harm's way. So we're having a conversation about managed retreat, right? But you notice the only people we're talking about managing their retreat away from the threats of climate change are well-off middle class and upper middle class white communities. We're not moving tribal communities. We're not moving African American communities. We're not moving Latino communities. We're only moving the people who we think their property and their lives are of value. That inherently is a value system that is mired in racism. And that means that we're going to leave the same people behind again and again and again. I don't know about you all, but I'm so tired of this conversation, but I'm also so emotionally wrought by this conversation. So the last thing I would say is this. My family lives in the Bahamas. My father was born in the Bahamas. Most of my family lives in the Bahamas. Every hurricane season, I am on pins and needles because I have to worry about whether or not these storms are going to devastate them the way that a storm came through the Bahamas and did in 2019. And it literally wiped one island off the face of the map. And if that hurricane had moved just a few degrees to the east, it would have devastated the most populous island in the Bahamas, Nassau, or New Providence Island, where 400,000 people live. At least 10,000 of them are the Miller clan. My family, that's where they're based. And so maybe everyone doesn't pay attention to this the way that I do. Maybe everybody doesn't watch the Weather Channel on a regular basis. Dr. Hollis can tell you, I'm always watching the Weather Channel and I'm always saying, Adrienne, are you seeing this? Adrienne, are you watching this? Because I see where the vulnerability is. And I see that its footprint is about where people of color are, whether they're in the Americas, whether they're in the South Pacific, whether they're in Africa, whether they're in Asia. Wherever we are in the world, we are more vulnerable to this threat from climate change than any other group of people. And we can't just keep accepting that and saying that that is okay. It is not okay.
Thank you, Vernice. As always, super inspiring and a great way to frame the discussion for today. Thank you for that. Dr. Hollis, Adrienne, I want to turn to you. We're looking at a lot of the upstream effects of how narrative has been impacted. But I want to ask you, how do you think the downstream impacts of race and racism play out for those experiencing it? What does it mean in the context of climate change and COVID? And how do these two phenomena play out in terms of if they need information to healthcare, for example?
That's a great question, Surili, and thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to be here with this panel. Before we begin, I'd like to just do a land acknowledgement. Vernice and I both are in PG County, Prince George's County, Maryland, the stolen land of the Mattapan, the Patuxent, the Piscataway, the Moyon, the Pamunkey, and the Accokeek. And I just like to honor that. To answer your question, we've seen it play out clearly, and I've been writing about this for the last year and a half, in the lack of data, for example, when it comes to COVID-19. I live in PG County, which had the highest incidence of COVID in Maryland, deaths and infection, and it also has one of the highest, or the highest African-American community, but the data was never reported like that. And I know Vernice and I both would tweet about that, like, why aren't we getting data? Why aren't we getting race and ethnic data? Because you need that, right? And one of the reasons that I think that lack of data is so impactful is, for example, when it comes to the administration of the vaccine. You know, of course, frontline workers, our medical personnel, and all frontline and essential workers. But then let's look at areas of where the populations are most at risk, right? And we know that that's communities of color and poor people, so that they should be the next in line. And actually, someone pointed out to me that, well, when you look at age and we get to the older population, you don't see that many people of color dying from COVID. And as I like to point out, that's because for a number of reasons, we don't live as long. So when you get to that age group, you've totally missed a population that's at risk. Another reason that data is so important when it comes to COVID is, remember when people were gathering this contact data, it wasn't really used as effectively, I think, as it could have been. Because now when we talk about vaccine in areas that have areas of people that haven't been vaccinated, use that data, to see where people were, where the populations are that were exposed. Are those the populations that are not vaccinated or not fully vaccinated? Use the data you have and gather the data you need based on race and ethnicity, because we need to know what makes a person susceptible and why, and where those areas are in the country. So what we've seen is a rollout that I consider to be inefficient. And not only here in the US, but I think there's a pattern in internationally where we look at the poorest nations that are not, they don't have ready access to the vaccine. And then the US will offer the vaccine that hasn't even been approved here, right, to those communities. And that boggles my mind. And those are just examples of where I think data and access to data for analysis and for action are so important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for driving the connection between what we're seeing anecdotally and the data that is there or not. Jacqui, I'd like to turn to you next. I don't think I'm bold or alone when I say that the lack of action or deliberate misdirection of resources from communities who need them the most during or after a climate event is categorically defined as abuse and neglect. Can you tell us how the constant and generational abuse and neglect by society impacts basic human needs and the rights of an entire people?
As best I can, yes. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, when we think about, in the context of the United States, when we think about even from the founding of this place that is now called the United States. Oh, first I'll say too, in terms of land acknowledgement, speaking of, I am currently in what's now called Anchorage, but it's the unceded territory of the Dena'ina nations. And so I really want to start there in terms of when we talk about abuse and neglect from the time that this nation was stolen. We have this situation where this false notion of scarcity and the real notion of greed, this false notion of the need to exploit and dominate in order to have what people want, really what were the founding principles and practices of what's now called the United States. So we had people who were driven off of their lands, that lands were stolen, people were displaced, people were murdered. Again, this idea of the founding fathers, which is often romanticized, but really what we're talking about is people who were thieves and murderers. And then we have people who went over to sub-Saharan Africa, and again, theft, displacement, murder, and then enslavement. So capturing people, putting them in hulls of ships. I mean, when you talk about abuse, people being treated as subhuman by stacking people in the hulls of ships, and as they died in the Middle Passage, just being thrown overboard as if they were disposable, like a used piece of tissue. And so again, considering their work to be essential, but the workers to be disposable. And we see that all the way up until today. When we talk about, and again, essential land, but disposable inhabitants, starting from the indigenous folks whose land we're all occupying now, in unceded territory. And then now, even when we're talking about putting plants or other toxic practices in facilities, it's the land that's essential, but the people who are around it who are now the ones who are dying disproportionately of asthma or cancer or heart disease and so forth. The people who are around it are disposable and neglected and disregarded. And then when we talk about in the global context, again, essential resources, but disposable nations. And so the way that the US imperialism has driven, whether it's kind of the oil and gas exploration, or it's the fact that we're 4% of the global population, but 25 and upwards % of the emissions that drive climate change. Yet when people come over in climate forced migration because their lands are now inhabitable because of our actions, then we greet them with whips and cages. I mean, so just really from A to Z, we see that the intersections with the ways that the land is abused and the ways that our ecosystem and earth is abused, and that the people are abused, again, all towards this reckless pursuit of wealth and power. So it's my little answer to the big question. Thank you.
Thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack there, but I want to turn to Shadiin before we begin to dissect all the amazing things that have already been said. And I guarantee you more amazing is to come from Shadiin, no pressure. Indigenous women are targets of genocidal policies and are the key to reversal of climate change. The basic human rights of women are also under scrutiny. Simply put, what are some of the powerful ways to interpret this narrative of erasure and its associated violent impacts on women?
Thanks, Surili. My head is just spinning from listening to my sister's talk about this. So be patient with me as I try to navigate thinking about what they said is informing what I'd hoped to talk with you all today about. My name is Shadiin Garcia, Kawatsi de Heneme Shadiin, Sinahanu Sta. I am Chicana and Laguna Pueblo from the Turkey clan, born in the heart of Aslan. I'm the granddaughter of Dorothy Yazzie and Amelia Rivera, and I'm currently coming to you from Kalapuya land. You just heard all four of my sisters talk: health access, elevated disease, mortality rates, poverty, food, insecurity, data justice, or rather data injustice, COVID, climate, and all. I want to talk to you for a second about the erasure of Indigenous peoples and women in particular, which may beg the question, what does the erasure of Indigenous peoples have to do with environmental justice? And if you ask that question, I feel like you made my point, and I say that with love and gentle provocation. Step one to destroying the planet is to decouple people from the concept of land and water. Step two is to dehumanize the people who disagree with that concept of decoupling. In step one, it means normalizing terminology like resource, conservation, opportunities to mine, and seeks to operationalize extraction, exploitation, and scarcity. In step two, it means to create and implement a violent trajectory of dehumanizing Indigenous peoples, stealing the land, violating treaty rights and our sovereignty, an attempted extinction of Indigenous peoples, violent education policies that work to separate children from their families, eliminate Indigenous languages, although they did not succeed. And the infrastructure itself is doing its level best to codify our erasure via media, cowboys and Indians, wrong retelling of Pocahontas, erasure in the contemporary section of curriculum in schools. 87% of state level history standards fail to cover Native people in a post-1900 context. Keeping children in physical walls for learning instead of being outside, keeping educated preparation programs centered in methodologies of individualism and white supremacy, all the way to, quite frankly, firing on us with water hoses when we try to protect our kin relations, water and land. The forced assimilation worked hard to interrupt matrilineal societies because they were perceived as the most threatening. The trajectory that I laid out is writ large, but when you layer onto that a target of women, Indigenous women, you get forced sterilization through the 1970s, rape and violence against Native American and Alaska Native women at an epidemic. 1 in 3 of us will be raped in our lifetime, 1 in 3. At least 86 of perpetuators of these crimes are non-Native men. Native American and Alaska Native women are 2.5 times more likely to be raped than non-Native women in the United States. This doesn't even begin to get it looking at the data, the lack of data, and the resources for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which is deadly in America. And our inability to have accurate data and resources to address this crisis is criminal. So what do we do? Was the question that Surili asked. How do we interrupt this narrative? We have to center asset-based, or as Dr. Eve Tuck calls it, desire-based thinking. knowing that we're beautiful and brilliant and very, very present, not erased. Our sovereignty is our unapologetic birthright. What do? We center Indigenous rights. Indigenous rights because they're equivalent to fighting for the rights of all oppressed communities, for Black and Brown brothers and sisters, for Two-Spirit families, for our kin relations. And I want to say this again, for our kin relations, including land, air, water, trees, four-legged, winged swimmers, and more. We need to lean into the many, many Indigenous communities, scholars, thinkers like Dr. Megan Bang, who reminds us that a US-centric approach needs to be confounded by a reminder that worldwide, Indigenous territories contain 80% of the world's biodiversity, 80%, and that a quarter of all the land outside Antarctica is still in Indigenous hands. That's shocking when I say that in a US context. So an approach that's grounded in US-centric framings of loss and erasure, quite frankly, may be the worst approach. What is the absolute opposite of extraction and exploitation? Think for a second, what's the opposite of that? Love, relationship, abundance, support to center Indigenous knowledge in every setting. Create the pathways that center traditional and contemporary ecological knowledge. When Jacqui was talking earlier, she talked about what choice we have. We can choose to center Indigenous expertise at the center or not. When people consider that Indigenous people are not a part of nature, but rather we are nature, folks can get a window into what that means to be more than a steward of all things, but rather our connections and actual languages are anchored in place. It means they're anchored in water, land, air, and more. We know the intimate details of the living world around us. The narrative of John Muir that was cemented into the American landscape, that was to, quote, keep close to nature's heart and break clear and climb a mountain. I'm sure I've got that quote kind of wrong, but like once in a while, I think he said, climb a mountain. That violence embedded in that narrative is the foundation to our dehumanization. Nature is not close to our heart. We are nature. The mountains he told us to climb are our family. And that's not the only narrative. We can talk about Pinchot and Thoreau and more. When you've heard the cries of land back from Indigenous people, and if you haven't heard it, invitation to listen more acutely. Land back is not out of greed. It's not out of scarcity. It's out of relationship and care. Centering Indigenous women and traditional ecological systems, therefore, is a logical response to our worlds right now. But don't act like this isn't a choice. We can choose to center them or not. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to sit with what you just shared, Shadiin. Thank you. And to all the panelists, I certainly appreciate this conversation, this entry and invitation to this conversation. I'm going to open it up for you all to ask one another some questions based on what you heard. I think there's some really great nuggets. What I will pose, and this is making me think a little bit harder about, is that the dominant narrative in our culture often reinforces who gets a seat at the table and who has authority to make decisions. So I would be curious if you have any thoughts on what are those calls to action to get the right folks to the table and those right decisions made by the people who are most affected. Anyone?
I'll say one thing and then turn it over to Vernice. I took this beautiful lesson from Jesse Beeson, who works in Northwest Health Foundation. And he said, if you go into a room and you're sitting around the table and nobody who is most impacted by the topic you're talking about and is present, end the meeting. Stop the meeting. It has to be led by those most impacted, period. Making a choice to continue the meeting anyway is choosing to continue to silence, avoid, and erase those most impacted.
don't know that there's anything else that needs to be added to that, because that is the foundation of it. But also, just extend what Shadiin just said into a policy-making conversation or a public participation about this regulation or that policy or this practice or that development. And you look around the room and there's so few people who look like you. And then the people who are experts who talk about whatever the subject is have really no idea what your experience is. And so you step up to try and inform that conversation in a different way, to try and lead that conversation in a different way. And people try to drown out your voice or, move that conversation to a different place. And I always bring that conversation back to center it to the people who are first and foremost impacted by whatever the issue is at hand. But whatever we're going to do to try to work our way out of the cataclysmic moment that we find ourselves in can only be centered and can only be led by the people who are most impacted first and foremost. And that, of course, is a complete rethinking of the way that we think about policy and practice and praxis in this country and in this world, to center it to the people who have the greatest experience, who have the most history, right? We're talking about millennia of history, about what is happening to us now. And if we want to work our way out of this, we've got to listen to and follow the people who know a different way, a different process, a different strategy.
Yeah, so can you guys hear me? Okay, so this isn't working anymore.
No, we can hear you fine, Adrienne. We can hear you fine.
Now, because without my headphones.
Actually, we heard better with the headphones.
So I wanted to say that I just tweeted about this, I think day before yesterday, about the fact that it's been my experience, particularly recently, that people who don't know, who've never really worked in this field or who've never been in communities or who haven't grown up like I have and a bunch of others, any of those or more of those in the environmental justice arena are speaking up, are listed as experts, are getting the funding, right? All of a sudden, there, as one of my colleagues, Omar Mohammed, said, these EJ groups are just popping up, now that EJ is a focus. And what I said in my tweet and what I'll say now is is pretty much, excuse me, communities speak for themselves. And if you're going to reference the principles of environmental justice, remember that one, that communities can speak for themselves. And with that, someone just talked about experts, and I always emphasize that the first experts, in my opinion, are communities, because that historic knowledge is invaluable, and I thought about this the other day too, something that happened when I was in, and I'll speak fast, when I was in Florida in Gadsden County. The Department of Environmental Protection was doing some, I guess, testing for leaking underground storage tanks. And just in conversation, somebody in the community said, oh yeah, they used to use this property as cattle vat dips. And DEP was like, what is that? They would literally walk cattle down this cement vat in the community and let them drip through the land. And no one knew that. That's not on any map. It's not in any data. And, that's the sort of information that's invaluable, along with sampling data that communities have stepped up and done themselves, because realizing that they are the cavalry, because things are happening at the rate of slow, right? Not at the rate that people need answers. So I think that, not only do we need to look to our communities with that historic knowledge as the experts and the leaders, but we need to give them the space to speak and step back and let them do that. So
I will just add quickly and anecdotally, I was in a meeting and we found out that the very folks who should have been leading the conversation weren't in the room. And so as I was kind of, people were speaking about it and I was speaking stridently about how this is wrong and so forth. And then Ed Whitfield, who some of you may know with the Federation for Southern Cooperatives, he just kind of got on the mic and said, if they're not here, I'm out. And he just hung up. And then I was like, oh. oh, okay, well, yeah, you know, so it was like, there's no other conversation to be had, you know? So basically I appreciated just kind of his unequivocal, like, you know, yes, I was kind of speaking out about it, but for him, it was like, the conversation's over, you know, and then he was out. And so the meeting ended quickly after that. And so that's the kind of, action that we need. That's the kind of standing strong on principle that we need. So I appreciated that. So I just wanted to lift him up and lift that up. So thank you.
You know, there was a meeting the other day and it was posted online, and it was, and no shade, it was all white people, and it was about accountability. And I remember tweeting, oh, I thought we'd done away with panels with no people of color on them, or no Black people, whatever it is. And of course, there were no responses, nor did I expect any, but it's just that, it's just what you said, Jacqui. And it's not just, of course, Black, it's people of color, it's Indigenous, it's everybody who is been victimized and disenfranchised, and that they need to be represented, right? Not just on accountability, but my God, accountability, really? So that just, you know, that I just wanted to underline what you said. It's so true. So
Shadiin, did you want to weigh in here before I speak again?
Go ahead, speak again, Vernice.
So I want to also say about when we are the people who have privilege, right? When we are the people who are extending the invitations to the meeting or hosting the conference or whatever it is, how we use that privilege to empower and lift up and find the people who need to be in the room. So, you know, there was a time when I led and initiated the environmental justice grant making portfolio at the Ford Foundation. And I was doing grant making globally as well as grant making domestically. And I made sure that I went out and found the people who needed to be in the room, but who were never in those Ford Foundation rooms, and centered the meetings around them. We would go to UN conferences in South Africa and other places around the world, and I would find those people who were really leading the conversation, but were not in the rooms of influence, and have them host a whole pre-conference. Okay, if y'all don't want them in the UN meeting, we're going to have a pre-conference where it's all about them on their land, with them showing us and telling us this is what this conversation should be about. It is important that whenever we are the folks who have that opportunity to create those seats, to create that table, to create that conversation, that we model for people what that democratization, what that representation, what that inclusion looks like.
I'll take a stab at going at the beautiful question that Elizabeth asked in the chat. She asked, how do we grapple with the fact that large, well-funded environmental groups, mostly led by white men, working on climate and conservation, still seem to view the environment as separate from the people most affected? I think the question she's asking is different than how I'm going to answer it. So I'm going to answer it in my frame and then invite my sisters to jump in. And so the first part of her question is, how do we grapple with it? I grieve. It's devastating. What it is like to think about the framing of environmental justice from an extractive, dehumanizing standpoint in real time looks like this. Because they don't see Indigenous people as people, because these white men who are leading this movement don't see Indigenous women as the epidemic proportions of what's happening to us. Here's what it looks like in my home. If I've got a bunch of aunties in my house, my sister Jonna Ann, my sister Beth, my sister Jody, my sister Mandy, my sister Lori, if they're all there, my sons walk in the room and know that 1 in 3 of us have been raped because we're dehumanized. You know what it's like for my children to know that? How do I grapple with that? I grieve. And then I insist on being a thorn in everybody's side. Can you name the local nations that are in your community? Do you know how many nations there are here? Do you know what the nations are like worldwide? Do you have any idea? A list of like Indigenous scholars, dreamers, thinkers. No one can list them. How do I grapple? I cry, I grieve, I scream, and I run at it with every single thing that I've got. Because what it takes to reverse this amount of genocide is like a gazillion times more than what the saturation has already done. So when people say, oh, we need to have one person on the team, or maybe we need to support an environmental justice group that maybe is Indigenous led. No, we need to eliminate all the others and center Indigenous led groups and framings. So in short, how do I grapple? I grieve, I dream, I cry, and I fight. With and in community. With, not as a part of, but with land, air, water, sky, and you all on this call.
Wow, Shadiin, I'm gonna let I'm speechless behind that, because I know that we just had a conversation the other day and Jacqui can attest to this at the weekend, about the fact that missing and murdered Indigenous women are not getting are not even getting the same press that we see in the general population. So there's nothing that I think can follow that in that regard. What I'll do is honor that and take this in a different direction when it comes to funding.
Hang on, I think Adrienne, we can't hear you. I think we can't hear you, and you're dropping down some amazing.
Can you hear me now?
And yes.
Oh, that was what I said was good. You missed it, but I honored what you said, and I wanted to just talk quickly about funding. And one of the things that I know a couple of organizations have done, and more funding groups need to do, is because the question that I'm talking about is that what you talked about, what Elizabeth said, is that we need to restrict funding to community groups. And one of the ways to do that, one simple way, is looking at budget, because chances are the budgets are going to be totally different. And we looked at the budget of communities. It's nowhere near the budget of the big green organizations. So let's restrict funding to smaller organizations in the first place. And then you can't just pull in an EJ group, an Indigenous group, whatever. You have to show a history of working in partnership with this organization, right? It's not about you getting funding for your entity. It's about working for the benefit of this organization that has been disenfranchised. And if we do those two things, we've already started out on a path of doing what's right and what's fair. And then to have the project should benefit that community. So look at the project in detail. It's not about funding for funding's sake, and it's not about just organizations with a history of focus on conservation, but what about on conserving the lives of people? No shade on the environment, because we talk about people and the planet, but yeah, I am a proponent of people first. I'm not ashamed of that, but I do see that that's not where a lot of our funding organizations are going, and we're not focusing on people of color. So I definitely wanted to say that.
So I want to offer, though, that people do have the capacity to grow. And I want to share something that I was confronted with recently and have been really sitting with. And Jacqui, an external part of this, but you don't know the internal part of this. So Jacqui and I have been working around a particular controversial policy issue on the Eastern Seaboard. And a lot of people are opposing that project. And I talked to a former colleague of mine at one of the national large environmental groups, who actually was my supervisor 25 years ago. And he quoted to me things that I had said to him 25 years ago. I was the first director of environmental justice at this organization. And he was quoting back to me things that I had said to him. And at the time, 25 years ago, I just wanted to shake him and say, really, is this that hard for you to uptake? But he was running it back to me. Well, the reason that we're doing what we're going to do, Vernice, is because these are the principles that we are adhering to. And I'm thinking in my head, wait a minute, I think I said that. right? I might have said it 2.5 decades ago, but I think I'm the one who told you that. And I said, wait a minute, what conversation are we having now? He said, one that you tried to teach me a really long time ago. He said, okay, so we're slow. It took us a while to uptake, but we got it now. And we're trying to be principled in the way that we engage with folks. So I'm saying that to you to say that people do have the capacity to grow and to learn, right? But you have to keep pushing at it. Now, I didn't think it was going to take 25 years for that to happen, but it has happened. And sometimes I have to say that those lessons came at great personal sacrifice for me to teach this organization, to grow and to learn and to be where they are now. They're not perfect, but they're so far ahead of where they were when I went to work there, as one of the very few people of color staff and very few people of color staff in leadership. And it was a huge emotional burden for me to teach them those lessons. But the lessons have to be taught so that other people, one, don't have to continue to have that experience, but two, the way that these organizations show up is different and is as an ally, right? And we're still teaching people what it means to be an ally. And in this moment where we're facing, existential threats from climate change, if this is not the moment for us all to grow, right? If this is not the moment for us all to learn in the face of the murder of George Floyd and all the other people, all the indigenous women, all the other people whose lives have been taken simply because of the color of their skin. If this is not the moment for us to grow, I don't know what that moment is, but I'm not going to throw in the towel. I'm going to continue to try and teach and uplift. Now, if you don't want to learn, that's your problem, right? But I'm certainly going to continue to try and lift you up and expand your worldview about how we enter into this conversation and what are the solutions and the strategies that we need to be pursuing to try and save ourselves from this cliff that we're holding on to by the thinnest of threads and our fingertips. What do we need to do?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vernice. We're going to open it up soon to the Q&A portion, so please do add your question to the chat. But I'm not going to let Jacqui off the hook that easily. Jacqui, would you like to answer this question as well around how do we grapple with the disparities between these big greens versus communities? Or would you like to take it in a different direction?
I will, maybe both. No, I will say that one of the things that I feel like I've been grappling with of late is around the nuance. As people know, with the project I've started, the Chisholm Legacy Project, one of her most favorite quotes is, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair, which I like. And even now we have these performative seats at the table even. And so having a seat at the table then needs to be nuanced with the decision-making power. And so whether it's a community advisory board or it's the Office of Public Engagement for various entities, or it's whatever, we have to make sure that there is decision-making chops that are engaged there. If it's a situation where people are at the table and they can talk for as much or as long as they want, but in the end, someone else is making the decision, it can really serve to be a waste of time for people who don't have time. And it can be serve as a waste of knowledge and leadership that we actually need to turn the tide. And so I think we need to be looking at each of these engagement processes and ensure that we're being very explicit about power in that engagement, whether it's a community advisory board or it's a public comment period, or it's all the different ways that we're even trying to move towards equity and justice by setting up these spaces, and make sure that they aren't just window dressing for a process that's going to continue in the same way it was going to continue in the first place. So that's the one thing I would add. Thank you.
Thank you. We did have a question from another audience member who says, to shift paradigms, we need to recognize our countries as colonized spaces. That requires stepping back and acknowledging the damage that's been done historically made to Indigenous people and people of color. Shadiin, I want to start with you and then open it up to anyone else who wants to weigh in. How can we advance towards that when the world we know today operates within a system we want to shift?
Yeah, I'll say a few things, and just I want to do a call out to the concept of pluralism. We all enter this world in different ways, and that's the beauty of it. The work that Jacqui does, the work that Adrienne does, the work that Vernice does, the work that I do, the work that Surili does, they're not all the same. And I know that Vernice made a very strong point about like the belief that change is possible, the belief that people can change. Our anger, our passion, our frustration can exist alongside a belief that change is possible. And oftentimes that gets misunderstood. Like, oh, so you're just frustrated, you're just upset, you're just what? No, we're here screaming this from the rooftops because we believe change is possible. And so I want to speak to that for a moment before I dig into the concept of the narrative and what needs to change. And so when I talked about how we all enter this differently, I believe my entryway, among others, is I believe deeply in what we can do to change the landscape of K-12 education by revamping all of our curricular endeavors and what they're framed in for all students, so that they can exit school with a strong working knowledge of indigeneity, sovereignty, not the way that it shows up in our curricular content today. I also believe we need to radically shift the way we do what we call science education in K-12 as this objective approach to the way in which we quote unquote investigate and put a magnifying glass on an ecosystem as though we're not part of the system. I believe one of the most powerful ways to change the narrative of the violence in to this earth, on this earth, is starting as early as humanly possible in our educational settings and have Indigenous people create the content that needs to be explored, critically examined, questioned, and marinated all throughout their educational system.
I like to jump in if possible. Very good points that that have been made. I want to add something. One of the things that I think is important, and I live behind, is the explaining the narrative, like you said, Shadiin, explaining the interconnectedness of things. And a lot of you guys know, and yes, Vernice taught me a new word, the syndemic. But I have been using it since then. And when two or more health effects affect the same population at the same time in a negative way. And I've been talking about that. And I think that people start to really get it, or as you say, people change when they start seeing how things affect them. We've been saying for years, pollution doesn't stay on the fence line. Everybody's going to be affected. Even though you're hit first and worst population, everybody's going to be affected. But now when we start thinking about how perfect example with COVID, right? We started thinking about, Vernice and I actually sat and had a conversation about, first you have systemic racism and where we were placed, right? Place and race. And then it was just the whole issue around environmental injustice and injustices, economic apartheid, as Dr. Jacoby Wilson and others have said, or food apartheid, or whatever it is. And then we have, in this instance, where we talk about climate change and how climate impacts the population, not as susceptible for population because it's strong people, right? You've put them in situations where they're at risk, right? And so the population itself is strong and resilient, but where does resilience stop? Where do we stop wanting people to bounce back and start creating situations where it doesn't happen, where they're not at risk, right? So I'm more about mitigation than anything, but we make this connection between these things and then adverse public health. And we hear about, like the CDC was saying, oh, people have pre-existing conditions. Well, why? Why do we have pre-existing conditions? Let's go back to racism. Let's go back to redlining and putting people in areas that are more dangerous to live in. And then all of these things collide together. And we have situations like I mentioned before with COVID, or like we see with the Delta variant, or like we see with any number of challenges that community faces, or like we see with what Shadiin talked about with our Indigenous brothers and sisters in particular. You know, because you've done this to us, because of the way you value people. And when we tell that story, like if you saw the reaction, that the heartbreaking and truthful story, well, it's not even a story, it's the fact that Shadiin told us, you know, when people start making those connections, that's when you start seeing action. And so that's when, you know, we start addressing the disparities and the inequities. So I'm sorry, I get excited about stuff like this, passionate about it. So I'll stop talking now.
So I want to just connect to a couple things that Adrienne said, and then ask Jacqui a question. Adrienne mentioned resilience, and so this word, I almost want to strike it from our lexicon, because what does it mean? It means that in our current context and in a climate context, it means that no matter how many times you experience climate-related disaster, right? And let us not continue to misname that as natural disasters, because these are not natural disasters, right? A volcano is a natural disaster, but a flood from, you know, a devastating flood from warmed waters brought on by the use of fossil fuels that have warmed the atmosphere, that is not a natural disaster. So that's one thing to think about. But then the concept of resilience, which in the climate context, we often talk about that as no matter how many times a particular population, a particular region, a particular geography is hit by a climate-related disaster, they're able to absorb that disaster and eventually to get back on their feet. Now, we've been getting these disasters so quickly, right? We've been getting these impacts have been coming so frequently that people are not able to bounce back. And my question is that really what we want? Is people to be able to bounce back from this, or do we want something that obviates the impact in the first place, or at least lessens the impact? I mentioned earlier, manage retreat. I just think we got to get real about that, right? Some places people are not going to be safe. And yes, they have an emotional and a cultural connection to that land, but that land and that place and that geography is now vulnerable. Do we need to continue to put people in those spaces of vulnerability, or do we need to think about something that takes them away from that vulnerability? And so my question for Jacqui is, Jacqui has actually spent a lot of time with FEMA, helping them to sort of rethink this. And Jacqui, I'm wondering if you could give us some insight into what those conversations have been like with FEMA.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so for one thing and related to that conversation and to what you were just saying, I was doing a talk on resilience and climate change recently, and I said at the outset that we need to change the fact that for some communities and people, that resilience has become a way of life. Like it's so constant, that the need to bounce back from this shock and that shock and the other shock, that that for us, for many of our communities, resilience is now in our DNA, because we have had to, as a people, just to be able to survive the constant abuse, as in terms of your first question, Surili, and the constant assaults that we're experiencing from society. And so that's actually in the conversations with FEMA, one of the things that I am constantly trying to get across in our conversations is the fact that this notion of making whole, and making whole being restoring people to the way they were before the disaster, is a very, very, very low bar in these communities, where the reason that they keep showing up, the reason that they have FEMA on speed dial, is because you just return them to the same vulnerable state that they were in before the disaster happened. And so, but how to institutionalize that, how to really ensure that there are investments and to change really the way FEMA does business all together, to reflect that reality is really where the change, where the challenge comes in, because they are, again, just trying to tweak a fundamentally flawed system. And so our conversations tend to go in a circle in that regard, because they feel so hamstrung by what they can actually do as an emergency management agency in terms of actually dealing with mitigation and dealing with the systemic change that it's going to take to actually make it so that people aren't being impacted in the way they're being impacted, and so that people truly are engaging in recovery and redevelopment that looks towards long-term systems change. And so like I said, those conversations continue to be tough because they feel limited by what they can do in a fairly constrained system. I'll just leave it there. Sorry, that was kind of a long, but that's the reality of it. Yeah.
Thank you, Jacqui.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing about that. And I think what reminds me from what you just said is that making a person whole, while we consider, our environment, be it our home or our community or neighborhood, however big you want to make it, part of being whole is also our mental health and wellness, and finding ways to rebuild and restore that line of mental wellness, in addition to our physical safety and health, is also really key. I'm reminded that even before the pandemic, a lot of Black and Brown communities across the country, Indigenous communities, there was reports out that said that they didn't have access to mental health services, or there was stigmatization around talking about mental wellness, anxiety, depression, etc. And that, I feel like, needs to be part of the narrative, especially because if you're listening deeply to communities, you will hear many of them, maybe not call it or name it, but they'll say that in addition to their physical safety being impacted, so too is their mental health and the mental health of their neighbors. Building that psychosocial resilience, building that sense of community cohesion could help. But that can't happen in places that are going to be constantly devastated by one disaster after another, led by climate change. And layer onto that, traditional mental health services may not meet the need, may not fit the bill. So having community culturally competent services or competent providers offering services that are accessible and affordable are also parts of that conversation that need to be had in order to really rebuild communities that are whole, not the way they were before, but where they should be now. So I appreciate you sharing that. Shadiin, I see you off mute. Would you like to share?
No, I think I was going to double down on what you just said. Like, if you didn't go into what it means to have culturally appropriate mental health therapy, that's one thing. So if you think about Indigenous people, like near genocide, like we're struggling to actually still be alive, right? And we're doing it, and we're doing like gangbusters. We're out there like producing, working, being, dreaming, living. And you know how hard it is to become a mental health therapist? Do you know what it is to actually navigate a white system and still be whole, intact with your identity, connections to, your family? And when I say family, I also mean land, what that means. So first you have to be able to survive a super racist K-12 system, manage to then go into higher ed, which is even more racist, and then try to attempt to sell your soul to get a gig to be able to live the dream that you're hoping to dream, to make the world better alongside your brothers and sisters. What is the likelihood that you're going to find a mental health therapist that understands that, sees you, knows you, and gets you? It's 0 to none. In Indian country, it's epidemic proportions, the lack of mental health therapists. And now take me. Right now, not as a child, I grew up in abject poverty and abundant love, but right now, I have a good job, I have a home, I have a PhD. I'm still on 5 waiting lists. Or not an Indigenous therapist, because how great would that be? Just a therapist of color. 5 waiting lists. What it means to actually be able to be whole and do this work is a crime in and of itself.
Thank you.
Ooh. Well, wow. So let's just take some space and let that wash over us, what Shadiin said, because it's so intense, right? But I will say this. There are people on this call, and there are people on the screen that you see, and there are people in the chat whom I know and love, who have been that community for me. So I just want to say that in lieu of, no, not in lieu of, as we are trying to get those other systems in place that help us survive, we have to help each other survive, right? And so I am part of a community of people who make me laugh, who bring me joy, who I spend time with. I will just tell you that 4 years ago, my late husband died unexpectedly, and Adrienne is responsible for me still being able to be functional. She will say that she didn't, but she did, because she made me laugh every single day. Every day, she gave me something to laugh about. Some days she gives me all day stuff to laugh about, but in the time that I really needed it, she was there for me. And as was Dr. King, who's in the chat, and so many other people. So I just want to say that there have been times when, when my spirit has been crushed or almost crushed, but it was the people in my life, and mostly my friends, right? And I'm not giving short shrift to my family, but unfortunately, your family doesn't always understand the places that you're in, the intersections and the crossroads that you're at, and the things that come at you every day, just in the context of living your life and doing your work. So having a community of people that lifts you up. Shadiin is in a place now with some of those people in her life. Physically. We did that with Jacqui earlier this summer. Adrienne and I were about to fall out, and Jacqui was on vacation in Jamaica and had to leave and come back to do a speaking engagement, and she offered up her space to Adrienne and I. Let me just say, Adrienne had to be talked into going on vacation in Jamaica, okay? It was not an easy thing. So my point is this: create whatever kind of community you need from the resources that you have to go forward and do the work that we need to do. But you cannot do this work by yourself, and you cannot battle all these battles and all these fronts by yourself. I don't care how strong you are. I don't care how many degrees you have. I don't care how educated you think you are. Stuff comes at you that we are not always capable of dealing with. And sometimes you can't see it, but the people who love you and know you can see it. And I just want to lift up those people, and Jacqui and Adrienne especially, and Shadiin, as she has joined Metropolitan Group, has become a part of that circle for me. Chantel, whose face you see, but you don't see her. She lifts me up every day. I just have these wonderful people, right? And they make it possible. And a shout out to you, Dr. Marvin King. I see you, girlfriend.
I'm going to comment. Thank you, Vernice, for that excellent and yet untrue characterization. I appreciate the extreme gross over characterization there. I do want to say, and I always say this, I think I said to somebody yesterday, know your worth, right? Know your worth. And I don't know who I was talking to about that, but and I don't know if there's a good thing, but I'm going to say the good thing about this pandemic, it's very few, is that I've gotten to know a lot of women. And I know that I've talked a lot with Vernice, with Jacqui, with Surili. We talk all the time, I can think, and just want to point out first that Vernice is talking about 2019. Just to be clear, I haven't been on a plane since then, missed my birthday, but 2019, and I did go to celebrate my birthday, and thanks to Jacqui for that. But I do want to say that know your worth, and that means what I had to realize is that we are important, just as Surili was saying, our mental health is so important, and the mental health of communities and what we have to deal with when we lose everything, when communities lose everything and are displaced, or even if it's climate gentrification, and they're moved out of space, right? But I feel like the groups that we've created, the Nubian Sisters, the group with Surili twice a month, or any other, the groups that I'm in, or just talking to Jacqui, I'm sure she sees my name pop up and just like, damn, here she is again. But these are, as Vernice said, these are my rocks. These are our trees that make up the forest of our lives, right? And I'm gonna, and maybe get in trouble later, but because I'm on the advisory board, I can say this. I would love for Jacqui to talk a little bit about one of the activities, one of the visions and goals of the Chisholm Legacy Project when it comes to this very issue, because it's so important.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so very, very briefly with that, but really through having this awesome network of sisters, including Adrienne and Vernice, and others on the call, including Marva, that I felt the blessing of that extreme support that has made me realize how critical it is to survival and thriving when we have these many challenges. And so with that, the fourth kind of, there's four kind of foci of the Chisholm Legacy Project, and one of them is this support for Black femme and Black leadership. And it's really explicitly saying, supporting the sustainability and well-being of women who hold so much for their families, for their organizations, for their communities, for the movement, even kind of being heralded for saving democracy in places like Alabama and Georgia. And so with that, we've explicitly said that we want to make sure that every Black woman leader in climate has access to a coach. Every Black woman leader in climate has access to a respite retreat when she needs one, and residencies, that every Black woman in climate knows what healing justice resources there are out there for her, and other support. So that's like an explicit piece that we are making sure is available, and thought that this was a inexplicably needed piece, because as much as we put so much on our backs, what often happens is that people will say, oh, you need to do self-care. You need to do self-care. And then they add another brick to your back simultaneously. And so they don't really realize what they're doing. And they don't really realize that if you're constantly under demand and you have a community that's crying out for help, to just kind of step back and do self-care feels self-indulgent in a way that is against kind of the way that we've been raised to be. It goes against the nature that we've been honed to have. And so therefore we have to really make sure that that there's a community care for the treasure of the people who anchor our communities, which is BIPOC women in general. And so that's why we specifically wanted to carve out that space and that focus of the Chisholm Legacy Project. Thank you.
I would add on to that too, that if the work that we're doing is on the clock, then our healing should be supported on that clock too. What it means, the energy it takes to do convenings like this, the energy it takes to show up and stand firm, learner sense, curious, create the conditions to be that facilitator, to help that org get from point A to point B, the amount of energy it takes, which we're happy to do, we're signing up for it. We know that we have a particular skill set and knowledge that we want to drop down. What does it mean, though, for your organization, to Joyce's question earlier about how do we get organizations to shift to support it? You actually have them embed this level of care and support in your work day, because that's what it takes to be able to continue this work. When it wasn't embedded, we then find other ways to do it. So when I was working for the state and I knew I had to go into a particularly tough meeting, before that meeting and after that meeting, I would sandwich my other sisters to help me out. I would sandwich April Campbell, who's Director of Indian Ed for Oregon Department of Education. Before that meeting, I go into that meeting. After that meeting, I have my dear friend Sarita Amaya ready to hold me as I came out of that meeting. Wasn't on their work day though. We had to put like lunch, or something coded so that we could do it. When our healing and mental health is centered in the work that we do, instead of having to go find another org that has culled the list for us. Imagine what it would be like if every major organization were partnering with all of this brilliant information Jacqui has culled together, and it was made known what it means to center us, to show up in right relationship to the work and the land. We'd be unstoppable.
Ashe.
I want to just thank each of the panelists for sharing your whole truths and your many truths. The narrative I hold very personally is that as a public health professional, it's my responsibility to promote health of all people. As a mother, it's my duty to protect the environment I'm borrowing from my children and grandchildren. And so with what you've said and shared today, I can't thank you enough for how far it's taken me in my own personal learning and how I plan on using it in my narrative as I continue this really hard work. Today, amazing points came up from talking about the same people being impacted by climate change over and over again, and valuing who are we valuing is the question. The lack of data or the data injustice, romanticizing parts of history as some who have the privilege to tell it have infused it in our culture, normalizing technology. We talked about let's disrupt the dominant narrative by listening and following the wisdom of experience that are about those that are impacted the most, and restructuring funding. Take away those traditional ways of funding and reaching communities and not have it be performative. We talked about the syndemic, of course, and striking the term resilience, and so much more, including mental health and power and women. I personally had to refrain myself from saying these amazing women are on this panel. This panel is made up of experts that also happen to be women, and women's voices, as Shadiin so beautifully shared earlier, should be lifted up because there is a lot of power that isn't heard because of previous narratives of making women less than. That's not to say women have a lot of also culturally shared knowledge and the power to invest, have consumer power, have decision-making power at the household units. They're thinking about their children and their parents and others that they care about. They're thinking about the way they show up in the environment and what their footprint is. So the last thing I'll say is I'm so moved by today's conversation. So, you know what, I'm not going to try to paraphrase this. Maya Angelou, this is a quote that I have posted on my computer all the time. It says, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will not forget how you made them feel. Thank you for the memories that I just captured. And I think I speak for a lot of people in the audience for what you've shared with us today. And thank you to Chantel for running our MC, Somya for being on the back end and helping us with everything setting up for the webinar. Carlos for interpreting for our Spanish-speaking participants, and of course for the Metropolitan Group, who really truly believes in the power of voice. Chantel.
Thank you so much, everyone. And with that, please feel free to email us at publichealth@metgroup.com and continue the conversation online.